The sun blazed over the New Mexico town of Redstone, like a relentless judge casting heat that warped the air and baked the cracked earth. Dust swirled lazily, clinging to everything from the warped wooden stalls to the sweat-streaked faces of traders bartering in the market's chaos. Voices overlapped, sharp and desperate, haggling over livestock and grain, while horses snorted and boots thudded against the packed dirt. In the heart of this clamor stood Clara, 18, her frame slight, and her once neat dress, now a patchwork of tears and stains hanging loosely on her thin shoulders. Her dark hair, matted with sweat, fell over her face, hiding eyes that hadn't dared to look up since dawn. Her stepmother Agnes, a woman with a voice like a whip and a heart colder than winter, stood beside her, yanking Clara's wrist to display, her to passers-by. "She's young, strong enough for work," Agnes shouted, her words slicing through the market's din. "Pretty too, look at her. She'll do whatever you need, just don't expect her to talk much." Clara's wrists burned red from Agnes's grip. Her bare arms, scratched from days of being dragged through towns like this one, sold like a lame horse or a cracked pot. She stood silent. Her lips chapped, her hands clenched at her sides, knuckles white as if holding on to something no one could see. The crowd barely noticed. Some men glanced spitting tobacco into the dirt. Others muttered about her usefulness. "She looks weak," one said, squinting. "Can she even lift a bucket?" Another laughed low and cruel. "Maybe she's only good for one thing, and it ain't cooking." Agnes's patience snapped, and she shoved Clara forward, her boot catching the girl's shin. "Stand straight, you useless thing. At least pretend you're worth something." Clara stumbled, her knee hitting the ground, a small puff of dust rising where she fell. She didn't cry, didn't flinch, just pushed herself up with trembling arms, her face streaked with grime and a thin trickle of blood from a scraped cheek. The market paused for a breath, then resumed its rhythm. Another girl sold in the heat, nothing new. Hooves thudded closer, silencing the chatter, and a shadow fell over Clara. Liam Carver, a rancher, widowed and worn by years of sun and loss, sat tall on his bay horse, his hat casting a shadow over features sharp as flint. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing arms corded from hauling hay and breaking horses, his eyes dark and unreadable as he dismounted. He stood for a moment, looking at Clara, not with pity, but with the calculation of a man who knew survival demanded hard choices. "How much?" he asked, his voice low, cutting through the noise. Agnes startled, then grinned. 200, she's yours. Take her and don't bring her back. She eats more than she's worth." Liam's gaze flicked to Agnes, cold and steady. "She your kin?" "No stepchild," Agnes spat. "Her mama's dead, and she's been trouble ever since." Liam looked back at Clara, her head still bowed, her body tense as if braced for a blow. He pulled a small pouch from his belt and dropped 3 silver coins into Agnes's palm. "Take it and go." Agnes clutched the coins, her grin faltering under his stare, then turned muttering curses as she vanished into the crowd. Liam crouched beside Clara, his shadow shielding her from the sun. "Can you walk?" She nodded, slow, her movements stiff. "Then get up." She rose unsteady, her legs shaking, but her eyes still fixed on the ground. He didn't offer a hand, but when she swayed, he caught her elbow, his grip firm yet not unkind. "I didn't buy you to save you," he said, his voice hard but even. "I need help at my ranch. You'll work stalls, water, cooking, whatever I say. I don't want thanks. I want results. You get a bed and food that's more than you had here." He swung onto his horse and held out a hand. Clara hesitated, her fingers twitching, then took it, her touch light, as if afraid to trust. His calloused hand closed around hers, careful, not rough, and she climbed behind him, her weight barely shifting the saddle. Liam nudged the horse forward, the market's jeers and dust falling behind as they rode toward the open plain. Clara closed her eyes, the wind brushing her face, and for the first time in months no one shouted, no one struck her. It wasn't freedom, not yet, but it was quiet, and that was enough to make her heart ache with something she couldn't name. The Carver Ranch sprawled under a sky so wide it seemed to swallow the world, its fences weathered and its barns smelling of hay and leather, a place where survival demanded sweat and precision. Clara arrived at dusk, her body aching from the long ride behind Liam, her eyes darting over the unfamiliar land that was now her home. Liam pointed to a small room off the kitchen with a cot and a single quilt, its simplicity a stark contrast to the chaos of her past. "You sleep here, work starts at dawn," he said. His voice clipped as he turned away, leaving her alone with the creak of the house and the distant low of cattle. Morning came too soon, the air sharp with frost, and Clara stumbled through her first tasks, her hands unused to the weight of buckets or the rhythm of chores. She spilled grain while feeding the chickens, the kernels scattering like lost coins, and burned the cornbread, its edges black and bitter. Liam's son Noah, 6 years old with a mop of sandy hair, and eyes that held a quiet grief, watched her from doorways, never speaking his presence, like a shadow that didn't trust the light. Clara tried to smile at him, but he darted away, leaving, her words hanging in the air. By midday she knocked over a milk pail, the white liquid soaking into the dirt, and Liam's patience snapped. "This ain't a place for clumsiness," he barked from the porch, his voice like a storm rolling in. "I need hands that work, not ones that break everything they touch." Clara flinched, her fingers twisting the hem of her apron, her throat tight with shame. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but he cut her off. "Sorry don't fix mistakes, go clean the stalls and do it right." She nodded, hurrying to the barn, the air thick with manure and dust, her skirt catching on splinters as she shoveled and swept. Hours passed, the sun climbing high, her hands blistering under the rough handle of the pitchfork, her back aching. But she didn't stop, afraid to prove him right. By evening, exhausted and raw, she slipped behind the barn where the shadows hid her from the house's judging eyes. She sank to the ground, arms wrapped around her knees, her breath shallow, as she fought the tears that burned behind her eyes. She didn't sob, not loudly, just let out soft hiccups of someone who'd held too much for too long. Unseen, Liam stood at the corner of the house, his silhouette blending with the dusk, his jaw tight as he watched her. He'd come to check the horses, but stayed, his heart stirring with something he didn't want to name. He turned back to the house, his boots silent on the grass, leaving no trace of his presence. The next morning, Clara found a small tin of salve on the kitchen table. No note, no explanation, its lid worn, but the contents fresh. Beside it lay a pair of leather gloves, scuffed but sturdy, their seams still strong. She stared at them, her fingers brushing the leather, her chest tightening with a flicker of hope. Later that day, as she hauled water from the well, Liam passed by, his hat low over his eyes. "Found those gloves by the fence," he muttered, not meeting her gaze. "Use them if your hands keep bleeding." She nodded, clutching the gloves, her voice too small to form a thank you before he walked away. His orders remained sharp: stack the hay higher, scrub the pots cleaner, don't let the fire die, but his tone softened just enough to notice. At supper, he lingered at the table, waiting until she ate her share of beans and cornbread, his silence less heavy than before. Clara held the gloves close that night, their weight in her hands a reminder that someone had seen her struggle, even if he wouldn't say it. She didn't know if she could please him, didn't know if she belonged, but the salve cooled her blisters, and the gloves fit her hands like a promise. For the first time since Redstone, she felt a spark of something stubborn and alive, a will to keep trying, not just for survival, but for the chance to be more than a burden. The Carver Ranch settled into a rhythm, as summer deepened, the days long and golden, with cicadas humming in the tall grass and the scent of sun-warmed earth lingering past dusk. Clara found her footing, however tentative, her hands steadier as she fed the chickens, swept the porch, and stirred pots of stew under the kitchen's low ceiling. The gloves Liam gave her softened the sting of blisters, and the salve kept her skin from cracking. But it was the small shifts in the house that warmed her heart. Noah, silent as ever, began to linger closer, no longer bolting when she caught his eye, his small figure hovering at the edge of her tasks, like a deer testing the safety of an open field. She noticed how he watched her knead dough or hang laundry, his brown eyes holding a curiosity that hadn't been there before. One evening, while snapping beans on the back steps, Clara began to hum a lullaby her mother had sung years ago in a life that felt like a dream. The notes were soft, carried by the breeze, and she didn't see Noah at first, sitting in the shadows, his knees pulled tight to his chest. She kept humming, her fingers working the beans, her eyes on the horizon, where the sky bled orange and pink. When she finished, she reached into her apron and set a small biscuit wrapped in cloth on the step beside her, sliding it slightly toward him. Noah hesitated, his gaze flicking between her and the offering, then crept forward his small hand, snatching the biscuit before retreating to his spot. Clara smiled to herself, not letting him see, keeping her eyes on the beans as if nothing had happened. From the barn's shadow, Liam watched, his arms crossed, his face unreadable. He'd come to fetch a bridle, but stayed drawn by the melody that stirred memories of his late wife. He said nothing, just turned back to the house, his boots quiet on, the packed earth. The next morning, Clara found a folded paper on the kitchen table, its edges rough but deliberate. In charcoal, 3 stick figures stood in front of a lopsided barn, a tall man with a hat, a small boy, and a girl with long hair. Below in shaky letters were their names, Liam, Noah, Clara. Her breath caught her fingers, tracing the lines as if they might vanish. She looked up as Liam entered, brushing hay from his sleeves, his eyes landing on the drawing. "He left that for you," he said, his voice low. "He sees more than you think." Clara swallowed, her voice barely a whisper. "I'll keep it safe." Liam nodded, grabbing a tin mug from the shelf, his gaze lingering on the paper for a heartbeat before he stepped outside. 2 days later, they rode to Redstone's market, Clara clutching a list scrawled on a scrap of burlap, Noah holding Liam's hand as they wove through the stalls. The air buzzed with shouts and the clink of coins, but whispers followed them, sharp and barbed. "That's the girl Liam bought," a woman hissed, her voice loud enough to carry. "Wonder what she's doing in that house besides scrubbing floors." A man nearby chuckled. "Ain't hard to guess with a pretty thing like her." Clara's cheeks burned, her shoulders hunching, as she tried to shrink behind a crate of apples. Liam stopped, his hand tightening on the sack of flour he held. He turned slow, his eyes cold as winter stone. "She works for me," he said, his voice low but carrying to every ear. "You got questions about her, you come to me, not your gossiping." "Tongues?" The woman flushed, muttering an apology, the man backing away with a shrug. Clara stood frozen, her heart pounding, not with fear, but with a warmth she hadn't felt before. Someone had stood for her, drawn a line in the dirt, and dared the world to cross it. On the ride back, Liam said nothing, his hat low as the wagon creaked along the dusty trail. Clara clutched the drawing in her apron pocket, its weight a quiet anchor. That night, as she folded laundry by lantern light, she hummed again, softer this time, and Noah appeared at the kitchen door, his small hands clutching a pebble smooth and round. He set it on the table near her, then scampered off. Clara picked it up, her thumb brushing its surface, her lips curving into a smile. Liam lingered in the doorway, his silhouette filling the frame. "He don't give things to just anyone," he said, his voice softer than usual. Clara nodded, her fingers closing around the pebble. "I'm glad he trusts me." Liam's eyes met hers for a moment, then he turned, stepping onto the porch, the screen door creaking behind him. Clara sat alone, the lantern's glow casting soft shadows, her heart full of something new, not just hope, but belonging. She wasn't invisible anymore, not to Noah, not to Liam, and that small truth felt like a miracle. The Carver Ranch hummed with the steady pulse of late summer, the air thick with the scent of hay and the distant bleat of goats, while Clara moved through her chores with a quiet confidence that had grown like wildflowers in cracked earth. She scrubbed pots until they gleamed, hung laundry in neat rows, and stirred suppers that filled the house with warmth. Her hands no longer fumbling, but sure. Noah trailed her closer now, his silent presence a comfort, his small gifts of pebbles or twisted grass left on the kitchen table like unspoken promises. Liam's gruff commands softened into something like respect, though his eyes still held a guarded weight, as if he feared letting her too close. One morning he hitched the wagon, 3 sleek mares tethered behind their coats, gleaming for a buyer in the next town over. Before climbing aboard, he turned to Clara on the porch, his hat casting a shadow over his weathered face. "Noah's been coughing, keep him out of the sun. Don't let him run wild, he'll hide it if he's feeling poorly. Clara nodded, her eyes steady. I'll watch him close, I promise. Liam glanced at Noah, crouched by the fence, poking at a beetle with a stick. Listen to her, boy, and stay off the high beams. Noah bobbed his head, not looking up, and Liam rode off the wagon's creak, fading into the dust. By noon, Noah's cheeks flushed pink, his small hands too warm, when Clara pressed her palm to his forehead. She sat him on the porch in the shader. Damp cloth on his brow while she brewed tea from willow bark and mint, the kitchen filling with its sharp, clean scent. Rest now, honey, she said, brushing his damp hair back, her voice soft as a lullaby. I'll fetch more wood and we'll cool you down. Noah nodded, leaning into the rocking chair, his eyes half closed. Clara hurried to the shed, her arms full of kindling, the task taking mere minutes, but when she returned, her heart stopped. Noah lay on the kitchen floor, a chair tipped beside him, a shattered jar of molasses oozing sticky across the boards. He'd climbed to reach it, his small body, crumpled his elbow bleeding from a gash where he'd hit the table's edge. Noah, Clara gasped, dropping the wood, her knees hitting the floor as she pulled him close. His whimpers cut through her guilt, sharp as a blade. I'm here. I'm so sorry, you shouldn't have moved. She cleaned the cut with trembling. Hands wrapped it in clean cloth and held him until his breathing steadied the tea forgotten on the stove. All day she tended him, cooling his fever, with cloths changing the bandage, her chest heavy with the weight of her mistake. By evening, Noah slept on the couch, his fever easing, but Clara's heart churned. She'd promised to keep him safe and failed. When Liam returned the next dusk, dust trailing his wagon, his eyes darkened at the sight of Noah's bandage, the cloth stark against the boy's pale arm. What happened? He demanded, crossing the room in strides that shook the floor. Clara rose, her voice small. He had a fever. I stepped out for firewood. Just a moment he climbed for the molasses and fell. Liam's face tightened, his voice rising like thunder. You left him alone. I told you he was sick. Clara's hands twisted together. I didn't think he'd move. He said he'd stay. I was only gone a minute. Liam's eyes blazed, his fear spilling as anger. A minute's enough. He could have cracked his skull, could have been gone when I got back. His voice broke raw with a pain older than this moment. I lost her. I won't lose him, not because I trusted someone who couldn't keep a promise. Clara stepped back, her breath catching, her eyes wide with hurt. Liam ran a hand through his hair, his voice dropping to a cold edge. Pack your things, you're leaving at dawn. Clara stared, her lips parting, but no words came. You heard me, he said, quieter but unyielding. She nodded, slow, her throat tight as she turned to her room, the house silent except for Noah's soft breaths. In the dark, she packed her few belongings, 2 dresses, a comb, the gloves Liam had given her hands shaking not from fear, but from the ache of losing this place, this boy, this man who'd begun to feel like home. She pulled a scarf she'd knitted for Noah from her bundle, its stitches uneven but warm, and laid it on his bedside table, her fingers lingering on its softness. She wouldn't wake him, wouldn't let him see her go. By dawn, she'd be gone. The ranch would fall quiet again, and the drawing of their 3 figures would stay tucked in her pocket, a fragile reminder of what might have been. Dawn broke over the Carver ranch with a stillness that felt wrong, the air heavy with the absence of Clara's soft footsteps and the hum of her quiet tunes. The kitchen stood silent, no clatter of pans, no scent of brewing coffee, just the cold, remnants of last night's fire in the stove. Liam woke to the emptiness, his chest tight, as he moved through the house, expecting her shadow in the doorway or her apron hung by the sink, but finding only the folded scarf she'd left for Noah on the boy's bedside table, its stitches a testament to her care. Noah sat on his bed, clutching the scarf, his small face pale, his lips pressed tight as if holding back a storm. Liam crouched beside him, his voice low. You seen her go? Noah shook his head, his eyes red-rimmed but dry, his silence louder than any cry. Liam's gaze fell to a crumpled paper clutched in Noah's hand, the charcoal drawing of their family. Liam, Noah, Clara, its lines smudged but unbroken. He took it gently, his fingers tracing the figures, his throat catching as he realized what he'd done. "I told her to leave," he muttered, more to himself than to Noah. "Thought I was protecting you, but I pushed away the one thing making this place feel right." Noah's grip tightened on the scarf, his small body curling inward, and Liam's heart sank under the weight of his mistake. The ranch felt hollow, not because it was empty, but because the wrong person was gone. He tried to work checking fences, feeding stock, but every task felt pointless, the silence mocking him. By midday, he sat on the porch, the drawing in his lap, his eyes fixed on the horizon where dust still settled from Clara's departure. He saw her in every corner of the ranch, in the neat stacks of hay she'd arranged, the mended curtains in the kitchen, the way Noah's eyes had begun to soften in her presence. He'd been scared of needing someone again, of losing another piece of his heart after his wife's death had shattered it. But Clara wasn't a threat. She was a tether pulling him and Noah back to life. He stood folding the drawing into his coat, his decision made. He saddled his horse, his hands steady, but his pulse racing, not for a sale or a repair, but for her. Noah watched from the porch, his small figure still in socks clutching the scarf as Liam mounted. "Stay with Mara till I'm back," he said, tipping his hat. "I'm bringing her home." Noah nodded, his eyes holding a flicker of hope, and Liam rode off, the hoofbeats echoing across the plain. He knew where she'd go, the old chapel on the hill, a crumbling relic of weathered wood and broken glass, where Clara had once paused during a ride, her voice soft, as she'd said it felt like a place to breathe. It was where his wife used to sit too, finding peace in its quiet decay, and Liam prayed Clara sought the same solace. The chapel appeared as the sun climbed high, its sagging roof draped in ivy, its windows glinting like fractured promises. He tied his horse to a post and stepped through the gate, the air inside thick with dust and the faint sweetness of wild thyme. Clara sat in the first pew, her back straight, her hands clasped in her lap, her dark hair loose against her worn dress. She didn't turn, but her shoulders stiffened as his boots creaked on the floor. "I figured you might come here," Liam said, his voice soft as the light spilling through the broken panes. Clara's eyes stayed forward, her voice barely above, a whisper. Didn't know where else to be. He stepped closer, his hat in his hands, his heart pounding. "It ain't your fault what happened with Noah. He's a boy, they climb, they fall, but I let my fear talk louder than sense." She turned, then her eyes red but steady, searching his face. "You told me to go. I went." Liam nodded, his voice thick. "I was wrong, scared of losing him like I lost her, scared of caring for someone new and getting hurt again." He knelt before her, his eyes level with hers. "I didn't trust you when I should have. Didn't see how you've made this house more than walls. How you've given Noah something I couldn't." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small silver pendant, its chain worn but shining. His mother's keepsake, kept all these years. This was hers, she wore it through every hard day, said it reminded her love don't break. He held it out, his hands steady. "I bought you once, and I'll carry that shame, but I don't want to own you. I want you with us because you're part of us, part of me." Clara's breath hitched, her eyes on the pendant, then on him. "I'm not that girl from the market anymore," she said, soft but firm. "I know," Liam replied, his voice warm. "You're the woman who's made us whole." The chapel held, its breath dust motes dancing in the golden light. As Clara reached for his hand, her fingers trembling but sure, the pendant gleamed between them, a promise not of ownership but of choice. Outside, a breeze stirred the ivy, a faint chime ringing from the cracked bell above, a sound as tender as the moment. Liam rose, Clara with him, their hands still joined the weight of his fear lifting like morning fog. The chapel's crooked door swung shut behind Clara and Liam as they stepped into the late afternoon light, the New Mexico hills stretching golden and vast, under a sky streaked with clouds like brushstrokes of hope. Clara's hand rested in Liam's, her fingers warmed by his calloused grip, the silver pendant now hanging at her throat, a quiet weight that felt like belonging. They rode back to the ranch in silence, not the heavy kind that had once filled their days, but a shared quiet woven with trust, the horses' steady gait matching the rhythm of their hearts. Clara's eyes traced the familiar path, the fence posts she'd helped mend the fields where she'd scattered feed, and her chest swelled with the realization that she wasn't returning as a worker, but as family. The ranch came into view, its barns weathered but sturdy, the porch where Noah often sat, glowing in the fading sun. Noah stood there now, his small figure still clutching the scarf Clara had left his eyes wide as he saw them approach. He bolted down the steps, his bare feet kicking up dust, and threw himself into Clara's arms, his silent embrace fiercer than any words. She knelt, wrapping him close, her cheek against his hair, the scarf's soft wool pressed between them. "I'm here, honey, I'm staying," she whispered, her voice thick with love. Noah's arms tightened, his face buried in her shoulder, and for the first time Clara felt tears dampen her dress, not hers, but his. Liam watched his hand resting on the horse's reins, his eyes soft with something new, relief, pride, a tenderness he'd thought buried with his wife. Mara, the housekeeper, appeared at the door, her apron dusted with flour, her nod to Clara warm and knowing, before she retreated to give them space. The evening unfolded gentle and unhurried, Clara stirring a pot of stew, while Noah lingered at the table arranging his pebbles in careful rows, his small hand brushing hers when she set down a plate. Liam sat with them, his usual rush to the barn, forgotten, his gaze lingering on Clara, as she hummed a soft tune, the same lullaby that had once drawn Noah from the shadows. The house felt alive again, not with noise, but with presence, the creak of the floorboards, the clink of spoons, the flicker of lantern light casting their shadows as one. Later, under a starlit sky, Clara stepped onto the porch, the air cool with the promise of autumn, the pendant glinting at her throat. Liam joined her, his boots quiet, his hands in his pockets as he leaned against the railing. "You changed this place," he said, his voice low like the distant call of an owl. "Made it more than a roof, and walls made it home." Clara's lips curved, her eyes meeting his. "You gave me a place to be seen. I wasn't anything before that." Liam shook his head slow. "You were always something, just needed someone to notice." They stood there, the night wrapping around them, the ranch alive with the hum of crickets and the rustle of leaves. Clara thought of the market in Redstone, the dust and the shouts, the stepmother who'd sold her like a broken tool, and how that girl felt a lifetime away. She'd been invisible then, a shadow sold for coins, but here she was, needed, wanted, loved. Noah's drawing, still tucked in her apron pocket, was proof of that, three figures hand in hand, a family not born but built. The days that followed wove a new pattern, Clara teaching Noah to braid grass into small rings, Liam showing her how to saddle a horse, his hand steadying hers on the reins. They worked side by side, mending fences, baking bread, laughing when Noah sneaked a biscuit before supper, his silent giggles a melody of their own. The townsfolk in Redstone still whispered, but their words lost their sting, Liam's fierce defense, and Clara's quiet strength silencing the cruelest tongues. One evening, as Clara swept the porch, Noah slipped beside her, holding out a new drawing, this one, with a sun above the barn, its rays touching all three figures. She knelt, her heart full, pressing the paper to her chest. "It's perfect," she said, and Noah's eyes shone, his silence no longer a wall but a bridge. Liam watched from the doorway, his hat tipped back, his smile small but real. "He's right, you know," he said later when Noah slept. "You're the light here." Clara blushed, her fingers brushing the pendant, her voice soft. "We're the light, all of us together." The chapel bell rang faintly in her memory, its cracked chime, a reminder of the moment she'd chosen to stay, to love, to be part of this unbroken circle. The ranch was no longer just a place to survive. It was a home where wounds healed, where silences spoke, where love grew not in grand gestures, but in the quiet of shared meals, mended clothes, and hands held under starlight. Clara, once sold as nothing, had become everything, the heart of a family that had chosen her as she'd chosen them. Liam reached for her hand, his touch warm and sure, and she leaned into him, the night sky vast above them, a canvas of second chances.